Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Sound Design September. As you can see, today we have a little bit of a different lighting situation. I'm still trying to get the best settings out of that, but that needs a lot of experimentation, so for now this will do. Anyway, going into the sound today, I have this sound for you guys. And as you can hear, we get a nice metallic texture that is easily cutting through the mix here. And that is what you want with these kind of aggressive sounds. You want something that is really kind of gritty and has like a nice texture to its high frequencies. Not something that is overly harsh, but not something that is overly dull either. So that is what we're going to look into today. Now I may notice that the kick and bass is doing some crazy stuff over here. This is actually from a production that I recently started. And as you can probably tell, it is a little bit more aggressive than the music that I normally write. So you can imagine that there's a lot more interesting content to come as I dive headfirst in this type of psytrance. Now, because this patch and a lot of the others from this session as well are actually from a production that I'm actively working on, I didn't really take content into account when making this. So for example, a lot of these synths, including this ones, use tones from my tones pack. And really that is where the whole synth is really based around. You can see that even in the effects, I'm not really doing anything extreme. There's a little bit of tube saturation, but the main tonality of the sound is going to come from the oscillator, which is just loading wave cycles. And one of them is adding two voices of unison, of course, spreading out the sound and giving it a little bit of detune as well. And then LFO1 is used over here to alternate between the two tones that it's actually playing. And this is a really cool effect because we have one that is going to be a stereo sound and one that is a mono sound. You're going to get this kind of pumping stereo wave effect that you hear. So notice that when this one is at its highest volume, you get a more wider sound. Now, of course, we don't want that one oscillator to be completely mono, so we are using the hyper as well as the dimension to add a little bit of extra stereo width, as well as the chorus over here, but this chorus also has a different function. You can see that over 16 bars, it is increasing the feedback and lowering the frequency at which it's active. And that is what is responsible for that kind of modulating sound. In this case, I've set an unsynced rate so that it's a little bit more unpredictable and you could get a nice like sweeping up texture one time and a sweeping down texture the next time. That is something that can actually make your productions a little bit more interesting is if you use some process that isn't deterministic. So that when you're rendering out the final track, you don't actually know which modulation you're going to get. Are you going to get the part of the modulation where this chorus is like sweeping up? Are you going to get the part where it's like sweeping down? Is it going to be just like the top part or something like that? So that can be an interesting way to keep a production fresh. But what I'm probably going to end up doing is actually turning down this rate and the depth all the way and then manually modulate the left and right channel over here. Because during the production process, what I'm actually doing is I'm exporting maybe say like 10 different versions and then I all store them on my phone. And there I can just kind of audition which of the modulations is going to sound best in the idea that I have for the track in terms of the energy flow. So then I can manually modulate in the effect and get a tonality that is like fairly similar to that or a way that it rises that is very similar to that. And you do that by modulating these two delays over here. That is what the depth is kind of modulating here. Other than that, the processing is pretty basic. As I said before, we have some distortion over here. I am tying the distortion to the envelope 1 over here, meaning that the release that I'll dial in over here isn't actually extended or attenuated by the distortion in any way. It's cut off exactly the same way as the release itself. That means that once I've written in the MIDI and I've gotten a groove and a length of the note that I'm happy with, that this distortion isn't going to extend that release and ruin the groove that I've so carefully crafted. Okay, so that is the example patch. What I want to do is I want to recreate this sound over here quickly in Serum so you can see how it's done there. And then I'm also going to do the same thing for those that don't have the tones blend, but I'll have to do that inside of Faceband because I don't think that with 3 oscillators, even in Vital, you could do something like this. Because as you can imagine, you do need a very gritty starting off point. And you're either going to use something like the tones pack over here for that, which is just those single cycles, and then you can just play a note. Make sure, of course, that it isn't in a too high octave, or you get something like this. That's not what we're going for. We want that really deep, gritty sound here. So we go down 3 octaves. And that is what you get. So of course, that is one route to do it. But if you don't want to use one of my products, then you can also do it through some complex FM setups. But you are going to need both oscillators over here to get that stereo effect. And also because we want the tonality to change a little bit over time. So that is what keeps these things interesting, is that you have like two modulations in here. We have that 1 bar modulation that we saw before, which I'm just setting up now, like this and like this. And then on top of that, we're going to layer another modulation, which is going to be much longer. In the last patch that we saw, that was the chorus. But before we do that, I'm just quickly going to copy over the MIDI here, because that is of course important that we have some kind of rhythm. I think I showed it before, but if I did it, this is the MIDI, and you can just copy that over if you want to. And of course, you can also come up with a pattern of your own. And now while it's playing, we can actually skip through the files that I have in the tones pack to get the tonality that we want. I think this is a cool idea, and now we can make one of them stereo. Let's go for this first one over here. I believe we've set up the modulations in the exact opposite way as we did in the example patch, meaning that when the example patch is mono, this one is going to be stereo and the other way around. So that might be a cool, interesting way of combining two of these patches, where they're alternating in the amount of stereo width that they have. We do of course want a little bit of stereo width even when our patch is playing mono, so we're going to set up the hyper and dimension. And let's add a little bit of distortion in the same way as we did last time. So just adding a little bit of release here. Let's again go for 70 milliseconds here. And then we get something like this. This is really where you can start to hear that stereo effect really coming in. I'm going to compress it a little bit, mainly to get out some more airy high frequencies. And as you can see, this is quite an easy patch to make like this, and it's immediately going to sound like a complex sound, but we are missing the long time modulation. Now, of course, we saw the chorus option before, but we can also use something like a phaser, which is a little bit more classical for psytrance. We can also go with a flanger over here for our main modulation, so that is going to sound somewhat like this. Of course, also a very classic psytrance sound. But there's of course also the filter that we can play with. So say we go into one of these multis over here, for example. You can imagine that playing with those two parameters can also make something very interesting. So there's a lot of different modulation possibilities here. In this case, what we can do is we can just play something like this. Let's set this to 4 bars here. Let's set another one to 16 bars and have that maybe rise up a little bit over time. And then we'll also do another intermediary modulation over here that is just going to wiggle both of these a little bit. So something like this. And I think that's a very interesting sound like that. So let's hear it in the context with the other sound that we have here. Now I'm going to make another one of these patches, as I said before. Of course, all 3 of these patches are going to be available up on my Patreon page. So if you want to support the channel, that is an amazing way to do it. Anyway, doing something like this in FacePaint is also fairly easy, and you have some nice extra benefits that you can use as well. For example, you can send one part of the sound through one lane, and another part of the sound through another lane. And therefore you can add different modulations on the both of them if that is something that you're interested in. But first we need a very strong tone. So what I like to do for that is just open up basically an arbitrary amount of oscillators and then set them to a random set of waveforms and then FM them in random different ways. So let's have this one FM2 of the oscillators. Let's have this one FM, this oscillator, and the oscillator that we're going to use over here as well. As you can see, we're just looking at getting some nice and gritty texture. And I think the best one for that is going to be a saw wave, because you can see that these peaks are all kind of jagged in different ways, whereas for these, they all look very similar, and that's they're all triangles here. They're all just like sine waves over here, and of course over here they're all square. But we want something that is like chaotic and random to it, so I think this one is going to be the best for that. We'll set up this last FM over here, and you can already see that we get something really nice and gritty. And then what I also like to do is add a fundamental tone to that. And this allows us to actually distort against that fundamental tone. So you can see what that does. Without it, it's just going to distort the whole signal evenly. And now these peaks are kind of pushing it into a distortion, and there it gets clipped off more. Of course, we don't want that effect too strong. And a little bit of stereo wave can be nice here as well. So this is going to be our first sound, which we will send to lane 1. Let's turn that off for now. And let's just start a new session like this. The cool thing about doing it like this with multiple oscillators is because there's so many differences that you can introduce, just even slight differences between all of the setups that you make and all of the ways that you're, FMing and stuff like that. Of course, the waveforms that you use and all of that has a massive influence on how it's actually going to work. It means that for every little change that you make, the tone that you're going to get out of it is going to be significantly different from the other tones that you've made in the same session, for example. So here you can see we get a completely different look to the waveform. And we can also decide on maybe using a different starting waveform as well. I'll get another analog for our sine wave, because I want to do that again. One cool trick that we can explore later here as well is that we can change the phase of this sine wave, and therefore we can kind of select which areas get distorted. For now, it looks like this is more of a single tone and this is more of a high frequency mesh. So I'm going to line up the zero crossing where the distortion is going to be the least significant from the sine wave up with the part that I actually want, which is going to be this messy area over here. And then we get our distortion and we get something like this. Maybe this level is a little bit too loud. You can also do that, of course. And again, we can do something like this. And here I want a little bit of spreading. And then we're going to send this to lane 2. And the cool thing is, because faceplate comes with a transgate, we don't really need to do any like difficult kind of modulation here. We can just open up a transgate and I will just duplicate this over. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set both of them to 32. And then I want to get the same pattern here as well, like so. And then here we can just remove this pattern over here. And now what's going to happen is that one is going to play in one part of the cycle and another one is going to play in another part of the cycle. You do need to make sure that you, of course, set both of them to lane 3 over here. Otherwise, this one isn't going to play. So if you set this to lane 2, it is going to cut the transgate out over here. And then, of course, there's no sound going to be playing here. And that means if it then goes through this transgate, it will cut out the part which you just generated. So that was an error that I just had. So you can set it like this. I do think we can change the tonality a little bit of mainly the second oscillator over here. Something like that is nice. What I'm also going to do is add the modulations. So let's go with a phaser over here. I'm just going to set a low rate over here, nice high depth, nice spreading. And of course, we can also add something like a flanger over here. Something like that maybe. Then of course we need to do our final processing. I'm going to add a little bit more distortion to everything here. Let's remove any low frequencies that we may have. Of course, we're using some sine waves that we need to cut out again. What I'm also quickly going to do is turn the attack all the way down here and give it a little bit more release so that we get a nicer pattern. It's a little bit more closely resembling our older pattern here. And then we just add a delay. In this case, we want a 3/16 or 1/8 dotted. Pan it to the right and then set on. And then turn on bounce for the ping pong effect. And that is our sound pretty much done. Of course, you can do a lot more with this kind of stuff, as you can imagine. There's of course a whole bunch of other ways that you can combine different sounds into one patch. This is just a very easy one that can be done in basically any synth that supports wavetables if you use my tones pack, or in the more complex synths where you can set up modulations like we saw in Faceplant. So that's going to be it for today. Again, all of the patches are going to be available up on my Patreon. Another way to support the channel is by watching some more of my content, so I'll leave 2 videos up on the screen for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.